My daughter smirked at me across the lawyer's polished mahogany table. "You're not mentioned anywhere," she whispered, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My name is Sarah, and for 6 months I had played the part of the grieving, confused widow they expected me to be. What my own child didn't realize was that the will she was celebrating was a decoy, a final test of character designed by her father from beyond the grave. Her cruel smirk wasn't just an insult, it was the final answer he was waiting for, and her victory party was about to come to a spectacular end. Have you ever felt like your kindness was mistaken for weakness? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. 6 months after my husband Mark passed away, the house fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It wasn't an empty silence, it was heavy, filled with the ghosts of laughter, the echoes of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, and the phantom scent of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke in his study. But the silence in the week leading up to my 70th birthday was heavier still, thick with unspoken words and a tension I couldn't quite name. This morning, the quiet drove me into Mark's study, a room I had mostly avoided since the funeral. I ran a dust cloth over his old oak file cabinet, my fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood. It had been locked since the day he left, a silent monument to the life we'd shared and the secrets he'd kept. His voice echoed in my memory, as clear as if he were standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "Everything you need to know is in here, Sarah," he'd said with a knowing smile just a year ago. "All the answers, for when you really need them." I dismissed it then as his usual cryptic humor, but now his words felt like a premonition, a map to a country I didn't yet know I needed to explore. Deciding I couldn't face another quiet weekend walled in by memories, I walked out into the garden. The late autumn sun was weak, but the roses Mark had planted were still putting up a final, defiant bloom. Their vibrant red was a stark contrast to the grayness I felt inside. It was here, surrounded by the life he had cultivated with his own hands, that I made a decision. I would host a party for my 70th birthday. It wouldn't be a grand celebration, just a simple gathering to fill these silent rooms with life, an attempt to reconnect with the world that continued on without him. My first call was to Dawn, our only daughter. "Mom, that's a wonderful idea," she exclaimed, her voice bright but distant through the phone line, the sound tinny and far away. "Of course Dave and I will be there. I'll even bake your favorite lemon cake. Do you need any help with anything?" "No, sweetheart. I just want you here," I said, my heart lifting for the first time in days at the thought of her familiar recipe filling my kitchen. There was a brief pause, just long enough for the warmth to dissipate. "That's great," she finally said, her tone shifting slightly. "By the way, is it getting to be a lot for you, managing that big house all by yourself?" "The yard work alone must be exhausting." The question, masked as concern, landed with a small, sharp sting. It felt less like a question and more like a probe, a testing of the waters. After we hung up, the unease lingered. I pulled out the old photo albums, the thick pages whispering as I turned them. I flipped through the years, tracing the face of the little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin, who used to follow me everywhere, her small hand clutching mine. Where had that sweet, unconditionally loving child gone? The woman on the phone, my daughter, felt like a polite stranger. In a photo from her wedding day 5 years ago, I saw her smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a beautiful mask, one she had perfected over the years. My thoughts were interrupted by the chime of a follow-up text from her. "Mom, Dave, and I have a very special gift for you. Something that will really help lighten your load in the future." A chill crept down my spine. Lighten your load. Her words echoed the strange question she'd asked just moments before. Later that evening, determined to shake the feeling, I sat down at Mark's desk to sort through some mail. I opened my laptop and logged into the old joint bank account we rarely used, intending to close it. An email notification popped up. It was a digital receipt from the bank, detailing a recent transaction. My eyes scanned the line items: a small automatic insurance payment, a magazine subscription I'd forgotten to cancel, until one entry made me freeze. A charge for $250 dated 2 weeks ago, paid to Anderson Real Estate Consulting. Anderson was Dave's last name. A consulting fee? For what? We had never discussed hiring anyone, and the charge was drawn from an account Dawn shouldn't have even known still existed. The silence of the house pressed in on me once more, but now it was no longer empty. It was filled with a single terrifying question. As the first guests arrived, the sound of laughter and music finally chased the oppressive silence from the house, but it couldn't dislodge the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I had spent the week since discovering that mysterious consulting fee in a fog of suspicion. Dawn's cheerful texts about party details now seemed laced with a hidden agenda, and her ominous promise of a gift that would lighten my load echoed in my mind. I plastered a smile on my face, playing the part of the happy birthday girl, the grieving widow rejoining the world. But with every hug and well-wish, I felt like a fraud. My best friend, Carol, was the first to see through the facade. She arrived with a bottle of my favorite Chardonnay and a hug that was less about celebration and more about support. As she pulled away, she leaned in, her voice a low whisper against my ear. "Don't look now, but your daughter and son-in-law just pulled up in a brand new Lexus SUV. Looks expensive." I glanced discreetly over her shoulder. Sure enough, a gleaming silver vehicle, the kind that costs more than my entire retirement savings, was parked at the curb. The $250 consulting fee suddenly felt like a drop in a much deeper, darker ocean. The party soon spilled into the backyard just as Mark and I had always loved. The air filled with the familiar scent of charcoal and grilling burgers, and a light jazz playlist drifted from the speakers. I moved through the crowd, laughing, refilling glasses of iced tea, and accepting compliments on Mark's roses. But my eyes kept finding Dawn and Dave. They were the perfect picture of a devoted daughter and son-in-law. Dawn in a chic sundress I'd never seen before, flitted from group to group, telling charming anecdotes about me. Dave followed, his arm possessively around her, shaking hands and smiling broadly. But I saw what others didn't. I saw Dave's eyes linger on the solid oak beams of the patio cover, the stone of the foundation, his gaze not admiring, but assessing. I heard him say to our neighbor, Jim, "It's a great property, solid bones, a real investment for the future." Later, I slipped inside to the kitchen to grab another tray of appetizers. The sliding door was ajar, and I overheard Dawn and Dave in a hushed, intense conversation in the adjoining hallway. "You need to relax," Dave murmured, his voice low and sharp. "You're being too obvious." "I can't help it," Dawn hissed back, her voice stripped of its earlier sweetness. "I just want this over with. Just be patient. After the gift tonight, she'll have to understand." The tray in my hands trembled. She'll have to understand. It wasn't a hope, it was a threat. My carefully constructed composure began to crack. Carol found me a moment later, my back pressed against the kitchen counter as I tried to steady my breathing. "Sarah? Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't form the words, so I just nodded toward the hallway. Carol's eyes narrowed with understanding. She took the tray from my hands and set it down. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely. "Sarah, the way they look at this house, it's not like they're looking at a family home full of memories. It's like they're looking at a prize to be won." Her words validated the terrible truth solidifying in my gut. Returning to the party felt like stepping onto a stage. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. Dave was now holding court near the grill, laughing with a group of Mark's old friends. As I approached, I heard him say, his voice carrying with practiced sincerity, "We're just worried about her future, of course. She's so independent, but at her age, one fall can change everything. We have to be prepared." The thinly veiled menace in his words was meant for me, a public declaration of their intentions. Just then, Dawn clapped her hands together, gathering everyone's attention. "Okay, everyone, I think it's time for presents." A few guests cheered, but I felt a cold dread wash over me. Dawn and Dave disappeared into the house for a moment before re-emerging, a single large, elegantly wrapped box held between them. They walked toward me, their faces alight with triumphant, knowing smiles. All eyes in the living room fell upon the glittering gift box in my hands. The cheerful jazz music that had been playing in the background seemed to fade away, replaced by the frantic, heavy beat of my own heart. This was it. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was inside this beautifully wrapped package was not a gift of love. It was a Trojan horse, a beautifully decorated vessel carrying their true intentions into the heart of my home. My mind flashed back to Dawn's words on the phone a week ago, her promise of a special gift that would lighten my load. The phrase, which had seemed merely odd at the time, now felt sinister, a thinly veiled threat. My fingers, clumsy with dread, fumbled with the silk ribbon. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. Dawn's face was arranged in an expression of perfect, daughterly affection, but her eyes were hard and expectant. Dave stood beside her, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, I realized. This was their theater, and I was the unwilling star of the final, humiliating act. The lid of the box lifted away, revealing not a cashmere shawl or a framed photograph, but a thick, glossy stack of brochures. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then my eyes focused on the bold, cheerful lettering. Golden Vistas, Senior Living, A New Beginning. Another one read, The Willows, Carefree Community Living for Your Golden Years. Page after page of smiling, silver-haired strangers playing shuffleboard, attending painting classes, and dining in sterile, cafeteria-style rooms. They were brochures for retirement homes, high-end, expensive prisons for the elderly, disguised as a paradise. A wave of nausea washed over me. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, and the faces of my friends and neighbors blurred into a gallery of shocked, pitying expressions. I felt the heat of 100 eyes on me, witnessing my deepest humiliation. "We did all the research for you, Mom," Dawn said, her voice breaking the stunned silence. It was loud and bright, a performer's voice meant to control the room. "We know how worried you get about the stairs, and the yard work is just too much. These places are wonderful. They have 24/7 nursing care, planned social activities, everything you could possibly need. You won't have to worry about a single thing ever again." Her words, dripping with false compassion, hung in the air. No one spoke. No one moved. Carol was staring at Dawn with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. I felt stripped bare. My value as a person reduced to a list of potential ailments and liabilities. They hadn't just suggested I was old and incapable. They had announced it to the world, wrapped it in a bow, and called it a gift. It was my neighbor of 30 years, Mrs. Gable, who finally broke the spell. Her voice, though trembling with age, was firm with indignation. "Dawn, for heaven's sake, how could you do this to your mother, on her 70th birthday of all days?" Dave stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand on Dawn's shoulder, his expression hardening into one of condescending authority. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "we're just being responsible children. Someone has to think about what's best for her, even if she can't see it herself." The party was over. The guests began to make their excuses, their voices low and awkward, their eyes avoiding mine. Each goodbye and happy birthday felt like a condolence. Within 20 minutes, the house was empty again, save for the three of us. After the last car pulled away, the silence returned, now filled with the wreckage of the evening. Dawn dropped the caring facade, her face hardening. "You should think about this seriously, Mom," she said, her voice cold and flat. "You saw how everyone was looking at you. They see it too. You need more help than you're willing to admit. We'll be back next week to discuss the specifics, and we'll bring our lawyer to help with the paperwork and make the transition smooth." She didn't wait for a reply. They turned and left, closing the front door behind them with a soft, final click. The silence after the party was worse than the insults. In the bright light of Sunday afternoon, my house seemed to mock my loneliness, each empty chair a testament to the family I no longer had. The half-eaten birthday cake sat on the counter, a sad monument to a celebration that had become a public shaming. My gaze fell upon the glossy brochures they had left scattered on the coffee table like unexploded bombs. I picked one up, my fingers tracing the smiling faces of the elderly strangers. It was then that I saw it, printed in small, discreet font at the bottom corner. Estate planning services provided by Finley and Thorne, elder law specialists. They hadn't just brought brochures, they had brought a threat. I was still staring at the lawyer's name when the sound of a car door slamming outside made me jump. I didn't have to look out the window. I knew it was them. A moment later, the front door opened without a knock. Dawn and Dave strode in, their faces grim and set. The performance was over. There were no fake smiles, no pretense of concern. They looked like business partners arriving for a hostile takeover. "We need to finish this, Mom," Dawn said, her voice devoid of any warmth. She stood by the fireplace, refusing to even sit down, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Dave, however, made himself at home, slumping into Mark's armchair. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "We don't have time for any more of your dramatics, Sarah," he said, using my first name for the first time. The disrespect was intentional. "We tried to be nice about this." He slid a document out of the folder and pushed it across the table toward me. My eyes scanned the heading. Durable power of attorney. My breath caught in my throat. It gave them full authority over all my assets, my bank accounts, and the explicit right to sell my property. "Sign it," Dave ordered. "It gives us the ability to handle your affairs and proceed with the sale of the house. It's the most sensible solution for everyone." I looked from the cold, legalistic text to my daughter's impatient face. "This is my home." "Dawn," I whispered, a final desperate appeal. "How can you ask me to sign this?" "Because you've left us no choice," she snapped, her voice rising. It was Dave who delivered the final devastating blow. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and hard. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You can sign this paper today and we can make this a smooth, private transition. Or you can refuse. And if you refuse, we will have no choice but to petition the court to prove you are no longer mentally competent to make your own decisions. We have witnesses from the party. We have a lawyer. Do you really want to be publicly declared senile?" A cold fire ignited in my chest, burning away the last remnants of my grief and fear. I looked at the two of them, my daughter, a stranger, her husband, a predator, and I felt something shift inside me. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "I will not sign this." For a second, they were both stunned into silence. Then Dave's face contorted with rage. He slammed his fist down on the coffee table, rattling the teacups. "You're being so selfish," he roared, his true motive finally erupting from beneath the surface. "Do you have any idea how much debt we're in? We need this." They stared at me, expecting me to crumble, but they didn't see tears. They saw a resolve they had never encountered before. After another moment of tense silence, they stood up and walked to the door. "You've made a terrible mistake," Dave spat as he left. The moment the door slammed shut, I didn't cry. I moved. I ran into Mark's study, my heart pounding not with fear but with a fierce, burning purpose. I had to open that cabinet. Kneeling on the floor, my hands trembling with adrenaline, I pulled out his old leather-bound copy of Moby Dick. Tucked between the pages, just as I'd hoped, was a small, ornate, brass key. The click of the old lock echoed in the quiet study, a soft metallic whisper from the past. I held my breath as I turned the small brass key, the tumblers inside groaning after years of disuse. As the heavy oak door swung open, Mark's words filled my mind, as potent as the scent of old paper and leather that wafted out to meet me. All the answers you need are in here. My hands, which had been trembling with rage just moments before, were now steady. I was no longer just a grieving widow reacting to a threat. I was a woman on a mission, following a map left behind by the man I loved. The single lamp on Mark's desk cast a warm pool of light, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. The air was thick with memory, a place where time had stood still. Inside, the cabinet was a world I never knew existed. I had expected old tax returns, car titles, the mundane paperwork of a quiet life. Instead, I found a series of meticulously organized, leather-bound binders, their spines embossed with gold lettering I didn't recognize. AM Investments, Coastal Properties LLC, the Anderson Family Trust. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. With a sense of trespassing on my own life, I pulled out the binder labeled Investments. It wasn't filled with the modest savings bonds I was familiar with. It was filled with official stock certificates, thick, watermarked paper for thousands of shares in companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Berkshire Hathaway. Tucked in the back was a recent quarterly statement from a private wealth management firm in Boston I'd only ever heard of in movies. I scanned the document, my eyes struggling to process the numbers. The account summary at the bottom listed a balance that made me feel dizzy, $7.2 million. I sank back into Mark's worn leather chair, the paper trembling in my hand. It was impossible. We had lived on his modest pension and my small income from the flower shop. We drove an old car. We budgeted for groceries. This was the wealth of a different life, a different man. A man I had been married to for 45 years and never truly known. After the initial shock subsided, a new feeling began to surface, the dawning of a profound understanding. This was why Mark had never worried about money, why he had always insisted on a simple life, free from the complications that wealth brings. He wasn't just being frugal, he was being strategic. He was protecting us. My fingers, now moving with a new urgency, found a small black moleskin notebook tucked between the binders. It was Mark's personal journal, something I never knew he kept. I opened it to the last few entries. His familiar, steady handwriting filled the pages, but the words were heavy with a worry he had never shared with me. October 12th. Dave strikes me as a man who mistakes kindness for weakness. The way he looks at our home, our things, it's with an appraiser's eye, not a son-in-law's. I see his influence on Dawn. She's becoming harder, more entitled. November 3rd. Dawn mentioned my health again. Suggested I should give her power of attorney to make things easier. I see now this isn't about my well-being. This is about control. They think I am a foolish old man. Tears pricked my eyes, blurring his words. He had seen it all, long before I had. He had felt the shift, the growing greed, and had carried the burden of that knowledge alone. I turned to the final entry, dated just 1 week before he passed, November 28th. I met with Robert Davies today. The contingency plan is in place. If the worst happens, and if they show their true colors, Sarah will be protected. I have faith she will know what to do. A contingency plan, protected. The words were a lifeline. I wasn't alone in this. Mark was still here, fighting for me from beyond the grave. My hands rifled through the last folder, my pulse quickening. At the very back, I found it, a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a formal wax stamp. Written across the front in Mark's hand were the words, "To be opened only in the presence of my attorney, Robert Davies." As I clutched the envelope to my chest, a shield against the betrayals of the present, my phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up with a familiar name. It was Carol. I answered the phone on the second ring, the sealed envelope still clutched in my other hand like a talisman. "Carol." "Sarah, you need to be careful." Her voice came through the line, tight with an urgency that immediately put me on edge. "It's worse than you think." My eyes fell to the desk, to the crisp, cream-colored business card I'd found just moments before. Robert Davies, Esquire, Estate and Trust Law. The world seemed to be sending me messages, weaving a net of warning and hope all at once. "What is it? What's happened?" I asked, my voice low. "Not over the phone," she said quickly. "Meet me tomorrow morning. The little coffee shop on Maple Street, 9 o'clock, and Sarah, don't tell anyone." The next morning, the coffee shop was a small oasis of warmth against the crisp autumn air. Carol was already there, tucked into a booth in the back corner, a steaming mug cradled in her hands. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her face was etched with a grim seriousness I had rarely seen. "I called Susan last night," she began, referring to her old friend who worked as a real estate agent. "I just had a bad feeling after your party, so I asked her if she'd heard anything about your property. What she told me made my blood run cold." I leaned forward, my own coffee forgotten. "What did she say?" "Carol?" Carol took a deep breath. "Dawn and Dave contacted her firm over 3 months ago, Sarah. 3 months. They didn't ask for a simple appraisal. They specifically asked for a consultation on the legal process for selling a property owned by an elderly parent who might soon be declared behaviorally incompetent." Susan used those exact words. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Behaviorally incompetent. This wasn't a recent idea born of frustration. It was a premeditated, calculated plan. They had been plotting to have me declared mentally unfit for months, laying the groundwork to seize my home. "There's more," Carol continued, her eyes dark with anger on my behalf. "Susan said Dave did most of the talking. He told them they were anticipating a significant cash event from the sale and wanted to know how quickly they could access the equity. They were already making plans for the money, Sarah." "What kind of plans?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. "A down payment on a new luxury condo downtown," Carol said, her voice laced with disgust, "and a large cash injection into Dave's consulting business, which Susan heard through the grapevine is on the verge of bankruptcy. They weren't just planning to move you out, Sarah. They were planning to liquidate your entire life to finance their own." I sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. It was all there. The new Lexus, the expensive clothes, the desperate raw greed I'd seen in Dave's eyes when he screamed at me about their debts. It all clicked into place, forming a picture of cold, ruthless betrayal. "They don't just want the house," Carol said, reaching across the table to grip my hand. "They want everything. You have to do something. You have to act now before they do." I looked at my oldest friend, her face a mirror of the righteous fury that was now solidifying in my own heart. The last vestiges of doubt, of motherly guilt, of wondering if I was overreacting all evaporated. This was not a family squabble. This was a war that had been declared on me long ago, and I hadn't even known I was a soldier. Carol leaned closer, her expression intense. "They think you have nothing, Sarah," she whispered. "They see a grieving widow, living on a small pension, alone and vulnerable. They have no idea what you've just found, and that is your greatest advantage." Her words were like a spark in the darkness. She was right. My perceived weakness was my secret weapon. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated Mark. And they were about to pay the price for that mistake. I took a long, steadying breath and squeezed her hand back. "Thank you, Carol," I said, my voice no longer trembling. It was calm, clear, and cold. "You've told me everything I need to know." We left the coffee shop a few minutes later. As I walked to my car, the autumn air no longer felt chilly. It felt sharp and clarifying. I got in, closed the door, and for a moment just sat there in the quiet. My hands were no longer shaking. My mind was no longer a storm of confusion. It was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. I pulled out my phone, my fingers decisively tapping the screen, and dialed the number for Robert Davies. The voice that answered on the first ring was calm, deep, and steady. The voice of a man who was never surprised. Davies and Associates. "May I speak to Robert Davies?" I asked, my own voice a stark contrast, thin and reedy. "My name is Sarah Anderson. I was Mark Anderson's wife." There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. "Mrs. Anderson." The warm, gravelly voice of Mr. Davies finally came through the line. I'd been waiting for this call. The next morning, I sat across from him in an office that seemed to be from another era. The room was paneled in dark cherry wood, lined with leather-bound books, and smelled of old paper and quiet dignity. It was a fortress of stability in my chaotic world. Mr. Davies, a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, looked at me with sincere sympathy. "Your husband was a very forward-thinking man, Mrs. Anderson," he said gently. He prepared for this eventuality. My hand trembled as I pushed the wax-sealed envelope across the polished surface of his desk. "Mark, he left this for me. He said to only open it with you." Mr. Davies nodded gravely, taking the envelope. He produced a small silver letter opener and slid it carefully under the seal. The sound of the paper tearing was the only noise in the room. He didn't read the document inside, but instead looked directly at me. "Before we proceed," he said, "Mark wanted me to explain a few things to you. He loved you and Dawn more than anything, but he was not a simple bicycle mechanic. He was also a remarkably shrewd investor. Over 40 years, he quietly built a significant fortune." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He kept it a secret for 2 reasons. First, he despised what new money did to families and wanted you both to live a life grounded in real values. Second, he became worried." "Worried about what?" I whispered. "He was worried about Dave's influence over Dawn," Mr. Davies said delicately. "He saw a growing sense of entitlement in your daughter and a predatory greed in her husband. He created this entire structure to protect you and to give Dawn a final test of character." He then slid a portfolio across the desk. It was the original of the investment statement I had found. The numbers were still just as staggering. He explained the properties, the stock holdings, the multi-million-dollar trust fund that Mark had established in my name years ago. I felt a wave of vertigo, not just from the shock of the wealth, but from the depth of the secret my husband had carried. Finally, Mr. Davies picked up the document from the envelope. "Which brings us to this," he said. "Mark created 2 wills. The first one, a simple document leaving the house and a small savings account to Dawn, was filed publicly upon his death. It was the decoy, the bait for the trap." He then held up the document he had just unsealed. "This is his true and final testament, legally superseding the first one, and it contains what we referred to as the morality clause." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mr. Davies put on his reading glasses and read a single, powerful paragraph from the will, Mark's voice seeming to fill the room through his words. "Therefore, the distribution of any assets from the Anderson Family Trust to my daughter, Dawn Anderson, is entirely contingent upon the respect, loyalty, and sincere care she has shown for her mother in the 6 months following my passing. The sole and final arbiter of this condition is my beloved wife, Sarah Anderson. If, in her judgment, Dawn has failed this test, her claim to any inheritance beyond the contents of the decoy will is rendered null and void." The air left my lungs. The brilliance of it, the terrible loving foresight, was overwhelming. Mark hadn't just left me money, he had left me power, he had left me justice. I looked at Mr. Davies, my mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with blinding clarity. The finality of my situation, the path forward, was suddenly illuminated. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice steady for the first time in months. A small, sad smile touched Mr. Davies's lips. "Now, Mrs. Anderson," he said, folding his hands on the desk, "we let them walk right into the trap they've set for themselves." Leaving the lawyer's office, I felt as if I'd been handed a new script. My life was no longer a tragedy I was forced to endure, but a play in which I had been given the starring role. My part, a confused, frightened, and defeated old woman on the verge of surrender. It was a role I knew I could play to perfection, because for the last 6 months, it was what my daughter had been trying to convince me I was. Now I would give her the performance of a lifetime. I let a full day pass, a day of agonizing silence from their end, before I made my move. That evening, I dialed Dawn's number, taking a shaky breath before she answered, summoning the image of myself at my most vulnerable. "Hello?" Dawn's voice was sharp, impatient. "Dawn, dear." "It's Mom," I began, intentionally letting my voice tremble, pitching it higher with a note of weary fragility. I've been thinking about what you and Dave said." I heard a muffled sound like she was covering the phone to whisper to someone. When she came back on the line, her voice was dripping with a cloying, false sweetness. "Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you called. We were so worried about you." "I'm just so tired of fighting," I continued, letting a soft sob crack my voice. Maybe you're right. I just want some peace." "Of course, Mom. That's all we want for you," she cooed. I could practically hear the triumphant smile in her voice. "Why don't Dave and I come over tomorrow afternoon? We can talk through the options again, nice and slow." They arrived the next day looking like vultures circling their prey. Dave carried the same manila folder, and Dawn had a look of barely concealed victory. I had set the stage for them, leaving a few teacups unwashed in the sink and forgetting my reading glasses on the counter to add to the effect. "Here are the papers again, Sarah," Dave said, his tone now patronizing, like he was speaking to a child. He spread the power of attorney document on the dining table. "It's all very standard. It just lets us help you." I picked up the document, holding it a little too close to my face. I squinted. "Oh dear, there are so many big words here," I murmured, feigning confusion. "What does this fiduciary word mean? It sounds so complicated." Dawn and Dave exchanged a look, a mix of annoyance and smug satisfaction. "It just means we have to act in your best interest, Mom," Dawn explained slowly, over-enunciating each syllable. "It's for your protection." I spent the next 20 minutes asking naive, circular questions, pretending to lose my train of thought and sighing with theatrical helplessness. I saw Dave tap his foot with impatience, but Dawn just kept smiling her predatory smile, convinced she was successfully managing a senile old woman. They thought they were breaking me down, but with every passing minute, my resolve hardened like steel. Finally, I pushed the papers away with a weary hand. "It's too much for me to decide right now," I said, looking at them with what I hoped were lost, defeated eyes. "But your father, I just want to know what he wanted. Mr. Davies called to schedule the official will reading. If I could just hear what your father's will says first, maybe then everything will be clearer. Maybe then I can sign these." It was the perfect bait. I wasn't refusing them outright, which would have triggered their aggression. Instead, I was offering them the one thing they wanted most, gift wrapped in my apparent surrender. By tying my signature to the will reading, I was ensuring they would walk willingly into the trap Mark and Mr. Davies had set. The relief on their faces was palpable. They thought they had won. "Of course, Mom," Dawn said, quickly gathering the documents. "That makes perfect sense. We'll all go to the reading together." As they got up to leave, I walked them to the door. Dave, believing I was out of earshot, whispered to Dawn in the hallway, his voice thick with arrogance. "See? I told you. A little pressure and she crumbles. This is going to be easier than I thought." I closed the door behind them, my frail, trembling facade dissolving the instant the lock clicked. A cold, hard smile touched my lips. My performance had been a resounding success. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice calm and professional. "They've confirmed their attendance. Everything is ready. The will reading is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. The day before the will reading, Dawn arrived alone. For a foolish, fleeting moment, a flicker of hope ignited in my chest. I thought perhaps she had come for a private word, a last-minute crisis of conscience, a daughter seeking out her mother before everything changed. But that hope died the moment I opened the door. She wasn't carrying flowers or a peace offering. She was carrying a small, empty suitcase. "I'm here to help you pack a few essentials for the move," she announced, breezing past me into the living room as if she already owned it. The casual cruelty of the statement, the assumption that my surrender was so complete that I was already being packed away, was breathtaking. I had hoped for a glimmer of remorse, but instead, I was handed the final, most profound insult. I watched, a silent observer in my own home, as she began her predatory tour. She moved from room to room, not with the fondness of a daughter reminiscing, but with the cold efficiency of an auctioneer taking inventory. She picked up the silver picture frames from the mantelpiece, the ones holding the last photos of Mark and me together. "These are too fragile for a small room. I'll keep them safe for you at my place," she said, placing them carefully into a box she'd brought. She took the small antique clock my mother had given me. "This is probably worth a bit. Best if I hang on to it." She was looting my life, piece by sentimental piece, right in front of me, all under the guise of helping. The worst violation came when she marched into my bedroom. Without a word of permission, she opened my jewelry box on the dresser. My hands clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to remain in the doorway, a ghost watching her own desecration. Her fingers, greedy and quick, bypassed the simple costume jewelry and went straight for the two pieces that mattered. The pearl necklace Mark had given me on our 25th anniversary, and the small diamond earrings he'd surprised me with on my 60th birthday. She held them up to the light, her eyes gleaming with a covetous shine. "These are lovely, Mom," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "But let's be practical. You won't really need fancy jewelry where you're going. It's better if I keep them from getting lost or stolen." She dropped them into her handbag without another glance at me. Her final move was the most audacious of all. She pulled a folded paper from her purse and smoothed it out on my bed. It was a simple, pre-printed form. "Just one last thing," she said, her tone all business. "This just gives me temporary access to your checking account. It'll make it so much easier for me to pay the movers and settle any final bills from the house for you." It was a last-ditch attempt to drain what little money she thought I had before the official proceedings. That was the line, the final boundary. The part of me that was still a mother, still willing to find excuses for her child, died in that moment. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had the finality of a closing door. Dawn looked up, shocked by my refusal. The sweet mask dropped, replaced by a flash of pure, unfiltered anger. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I will not be signing that, Dawn." Her face twisted into an ugly sneer. All pretense of the caring daughter vanished, leaving only the raw, desperate greed beneath. "You're so stubborn," she spat, her voice a low hiss. "Why are you making this so difficult? It doesn't even matter. It'll all be mine tomorrow anyway." She snatched the paper back, her movements jerky with rage, and stormed out of the bedroom, not bothering to say goodbye. I stood there in the silence of my violated room, listening to the front door slam shut. I didn't feel the familiar sting of tears or the ache of a broken heart. There was nothing left to break. As I watched her car speed away down the street, I felt only a profound, icy calm. She had not just stolen my things. She had stolen the last memory of the daughter I once loved. And for that, there would be no forgiveness. The battle was no longer just about a house or money, it was about my very soul. The night before the will reading, I wasn't afraid. After Dawn's final callous act, a strange and profound peace had settled over me. The rage had cooled, leaving behind not ash, but a core of diamond-hard certainty. For the first time in months, I slept soundly, a deep and dreamless sleep. Untroubled by the ghosts of what I had lost or the monsters I was about to face, there was no longer anything to fear because I had already endured the worst. In the quiet of the evening, I laid out my clothes for the next day. I chose a simple navy blue dress, one of Mark's favorites, and a single strand of pearls. Not the ones Dawn had stolen, but a more modest set I had bought for myself years ago. This was not the attire of a victim, draped in mourning black. It was the uniform of a woman preparing for battle, a woman about to reclaim not just her property, but her very identity. I found myself back in Mark's study, the door to the oak cabinet now standing open. I didn't need to look at the financial statements again. The numbers were already seared into my memory. Instead, I took out his journal, his last letter to me, and read it one final time. His words were no longer just a comfort. They were a mandate. I have faith she will know what to do. He had trusted me to be strong, and tomorrow I would honor that trust. Before turning in, I called Carol. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" she asked, her voice a warm current of support. "I am," I said, and the words felt utterly true. "I just wanted to thank you, Carol, for everything, for listening, for believing me." "Friends don't let friends get swindled by their greedy children," she said with a flash of her usual humor. "You go in there tomorrow and you show them who Sarah Anderson really is." The next morning, I woke before the sun. I didn't pace or wring my hands. Instead, I went out into the garden as the first light began to pearl the eastern sky. The air was crisp and clean. I walked among Mark's roses, the dew clinging to the petals like tiny jewels. A profound sense of peace washed over me. The house, the garden, the life I had built, they were not just assets on a balance sheet to be fought over. They were a part of me. And I was not going to let anyone take them away. At precisely 9:30, as I was pouring my second cup of coffee, my phone rang. It was Mr. Davies. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice the epitome of professional calm. "Just wanted to let you know that your daughter and her party have arrived. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson Sr. are here as well. The stage is set." "Thank you, Robert," I said, using his first name for the first time. "I'm on my way." I walked to the full-length mirror in the hallway and looked at my reflection. I saw the lines of age and grief etched on my face, but for the first time, I also saw a strength I hadn't recognized before, a quiet, unshakable power. This was the woman Mark had married, the woman who had raised a daughter, the woman who had built a life. They had tried to erase her, to render her invisible and incompetent. Today, they would see her in her entirety. "This is for you, Mark," I whispered to the reflection, "and for me, too." The conference room at Davies & Associates was cold and formal, a stark contrast to the emotional storm churning inside me. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the gray, overcast sky outside. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish, the scent of finality. I sat alone on one side of the table, my hands resting in my lap, playing the part of the frail, bereaved widow. Across from me sat my audience, Dawn, Dave, and his parents, a united front of smug expectation. I glanced at the handsome leather briefcase Mr. Davies had placed at the head of the table. Inside that briefcase were 2 lives, 2 futures, and only one was about to be revealed. They believed they knew which one it would be. The room was quiet except for the discreet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Dawn and Dave pointedly refused to look at me. Instead, they whispered to each other, their heads close together. I saw Dawn trace the outline of a new car on a notepad, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Dave caught my eye for a fraction of a second and gave me a look of such condescending pity that it almost made me break character. They weren't just confident, they were gloating. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Davies entered the room. He was the picture of professional gravity, his dark suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He nodded to me with a flicker of reassurance in his eyes that only I could understand, before taking his seat. "Good morning," he began, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "We are gathered here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Mark T. Anderson. As the executor of his estate, it is my duty to carry out his final wishes as they are written." He opened a simple business-sized envelope, the kind that held no surprises. The document he pulled out was a single page. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in a formal monotone. He detailed a few small bequests: a donation to the local library, Mark's old tool set to our neighbor Jim. I could feel Dawn's impatience growing with every word. Then Mr. Davies arrived at the main clause. He paused for a moment, looking over his glasses at the room before continuing. "To my beloved wife, Sarah Anderson, I leave all my love and gratitude for 45 wonderful years. As for my material possessions, I hereby decree the following. I leave the entirety of my property at 123 Oak Street and the full contents of our joint savings account to my only daughter, Dawn Anderson." A sharp, satisfied intake of breath came from across the table. Dave reached over and squeezed Dawn's hand, a smug, victorious nod passing between them. His parents beamed with pride. They had won. The house was theirs. The money was theirs. I was left with nothing but love and gratitude. Mr. Davies folded the single page and placed it back on the table. "This concludes the reading of the will." In the ensuing silence, Dawn turned to face me. The polite mask was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She leaned across the table, a cruel smirk twisting her beautiful face, and whispered, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, "You're not mentioned anywhere." Dawn's smirk was a knife to my heart, but it was also the fire that burned away the last of my hesitation. In that single cruel expression, I saw not a grieving daughter, but a predator celebrating a kill. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, something else rose up, a cold, clarifying anger. My husband's words, a memory I had clung to for months, surfaced in my mind with perfect clarity. "Truth has its own power, my love. You just have to know when to open the door and let it in." The door was before me now, and my hand was on the knob. Dave's father cleared his throat, ready to offer some bland, self-serving words of condolence and congratulations. The charade was about to be complete. They had the house, the money, the future they had stolen. I had been dismissed, erased. And so, into that heavy, self-satisfied silence, I moved. It wasn't a grand gesture. I simply slowly raised my hand. The movement was small, but in the tension of the room, it was as loud as a gunshot. Every head turned towards me. Dawn's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. Dave's expression hardened, as if to say, "Don't you dare ruin this." I met Mr. Davies's calm, steady gaze from across the table. My voice, when it came, was not the trembling whisper they expected. It was clear, measured, and carried the weight of a truth they could not comprehend. "Excuse me, Mr. Davies," I said, my words dropping like stones into the still air. "I'm afraid that is not my husband's final will." A beat of stunned silence, and then it came. A short, sharp bark of laughter from Dave. Dawn quickly joined him, a high, condescending titter that grated on my nerves. "Oh, Mom, please," she said, shaking her head with theatrical pity. "Don't do this. The grief. It's clearly making you confused. Don't embarrass yourself." She looked around the room at Dave's parents as if to say, "See what I have to deal with?" But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at Mr. Davies. He wasn't laughing. He He wasn't smiling. He hadn't moved a muscle. His expression was one of solemn, professional gravity. He held my gaze for a long moment before giving a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Our signal. The laughter in the room died in their throats as they noticed the lawyer's stoic demeanor. A new, uncertain tension began to creep in. Dave's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of dawning confusion. He was starting to realize that the play he was directing was suddenly going off script. Mr. Davies folded his hands on the polished table. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that commanded the room, "is correct." He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to their victory. "That document," he continued, gesturing to the single page that had given them so much joy, was indeed a will signed by Mark Anderson. However, it was not his last. He then turned to his leather briefcase, the one I had been watching all morning. The quiet clicks of the brass latches opening sounded like cannon fire in the silent room. He reached inside, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and pulled out another envelope. It was nothing like the first. This one was thick, made of heavy cream-colored parchment. It was sealed not with glue, but with a disc of dark red wax, impressed with the official seal of his law firm. And written across the front in Mark's own bold, familiar script was a single, terrifying line: "Final and binding testament, to be opened only in the presence of Sarah Anderson." I watched the color drain from my daughter's face. Her look of smug triumph curdled into one of pure, disbelieving horror. Beside her, Dave was staring at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, his face a mask of pale, cold panic. The silence in the room was no longer one of anticipation, but of dread. Every person at the table stared at the wax-sealed envelope as if it held their sentence, and in a way, it did. Dawn's face was a mess of confusion and dawning panic, her earlier smirk now a grotesque memory. The absolute certainty she had worn like a crown was gone, leaving her exposed and terrified. My husband's voice floated through my mind, a steady anchor in the churning sea of the present. "I believe in justice, Sarah," he had told me once, long ago, "but sometimes you have to build the courtroom yourself." Mark had built this room, this moment, and now we were all here to hear the verdict. With the quiet gravity of a judge, Mr. Davies cracked the red wax seal. The sound was sharp, definitive. He unfolded the thick, multi-page document within and cleared his throat. "This is the final and binding last will and testament of Mark T. Anderson, executed 1 month prior to his passing," he announced formally. He began to read, and with his first words, the world tilted on its axis. He didn't speak of my small house or the meager savings account. He spoke of the Anderson Family Trust, with assets valued at over $7 million. He spoke of a diversified stock portfolio and the deed to a commercial property downtown that I never knew existed. A collective gasp went through the room. Dave's parents stared with wide, unblinking eyes. Dave himself looked as if he'd been punched in the gut, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he did the math in his head. And Dawn just shook her head back and forth, a silent, desperate denial. But Mr. Davies wasn't finished. He paused, looking directly at my daughter over the rim of his glasses before reading the next, most crucial section. "Regarding my only daughter, Dawn Anderson," he read, Mark's words now filling the room with an undeniable power. "I have made provisions for her future. However, these provisions are not an entitlement, but a privilege to be earned. Therefore, the distribution of any assets from the Anderson Family Trust to my daughter is entirely contingent upon the respect, loyalty, and sincere care she has shown for her mother in the 6 months following my passing. The sole and final arbiter of this condition, with full discretionary power, is my beloved wife, Sarah Anderson." The room was utterly still. The legal language was a cage, and it had just snapped shut around them. Mr. Davies turned to the final page, where Mark had appended a personal note. His voice softened as he read it. "My dearest Sarah, if you are hearing these words, it means my worst fears about Dawn's character have been realized. I pray I am wrong. But if my daughter, under the influence of others or her own greed, has treated her mother poorly in her time of greatest need, then she has disinherited herself not by my decree, but by her own actions. I trust you to do what is right. Your loving husband, Mark." The dam of Dawn's composure finally broke. "No!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's not real. It's a trick. It's a fraud. He would never do that to me." Dave was on his feet too, his face slick with sweat. "This isn't legally binding." "We'll contest it," he stammered, looking wildly at his parents for support they could not give. Mr. Davies slowly took off his glasses and placed them on the table. He looked at the hysterical couple with a calm, almost sad finality. "On the contrary," he said, his voice cutting through their desperate protests, "this is the only legally binding will. The previous document was a test of character." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land with devastating force. "And you both, spectacularly, failed." The fight went out of them, replaced by the hollow shell of shock. They collapsed back into their chairs. The fortune they had plotted for, the future they had stolen, had vanished in a puff of legal smoke. I looked across the table, past the wreckage of their greed, and met my daughter's terrified, tear-filled eyes. I no longer felt anger or pain. I only felt a great, yawning sadness for the person she had chosen to become. "Dawn," I said, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through her ragged sobs, "we need to talk about your definition of respect." A dead silence filled the room after Mr. Davies's final, devastating pronouncement, broken only by the sound of Dawn's ragged, furious sobs. The world had been turned upside down in less than 10 minutes. The victors were vanquished, their carefully constructed future a pile of smoldering ash at their feet. For the first time in months, I looked straight into my daughter's eyes and saw not a smug, calculating woman, but a terrified, lost child, finally facing the consequences of her choices. The sight brought me no joy, only a profound and weary sadness. It was Dave who broke the spell, his shock curdling into a desperate, cornered rage. "This is a setup," he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You planned this. You're a manipulative old witch." Mr. Davies rose slowly to his full height, his calm presence a stark contrast to Dave's unraveling fury. "I would advise you to choose your words carefully, Mr. Anderson," the lawyer said, his voice like ice. "Everything you say in this office is being noted. You have no legal recourse here." But Dave was beyond reason. His rage then turned on his wife. "This is your fault," he spat at Dawn. "Your stupid, greedy plan." That was when Dawn completely fell apart. With a gut-wrenching cry, she stumbled toward me and collapsed at my feet, her hands grabbing at the hem of my dress. Her sobs were the broken, desperate cries of a child. "Mom, please," she wailed, her face buried in the fabric of my skirt. "I'm so sorry. It was Dave. He pushed me. He told me what to say, what to do. Please don't do this to us. I'll do anything." The raw desperation in her voice was pathetic, but it didn't move me. The time for tears and apologies had long since passed. I reached down and gently but firmly pried her fingers from my dress. I stepped back, creating a space between us that was more than just physical. "Get up, Dawn," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup, searching for a weakness she would not find. "The time for blaming others is over," I continued. "You both made your choices. Now you will have to learn to live with them, on your own." I turned to leave, my part in this sad play finally over. Mr. Davies held the door for me, a silent guardian. As I reached the threshold, I paused and looked back at my daughter, still crumpled on the floor. When you truly understand the value of respect, not the value of money, then you can call me, I said, my voice clear and final. But don't call asking for money. I walked out of that office without looking back, leaving the wreckage of their lives for them to sort through. The drive home was a blur. When I finally stepped into the quiet of my own house, the silence felt different. It was no longer heavy with grief or tension. It was clean. It was peace. I went straight to Mark's study and sat down in his old leather chair. The files Mr. Davies had returned to me were on the desk. Tucked among them was the sealed envelope I had found in the cabinet, the one Mark had addressed to be opened with the lawyer. But inside, beneath the formal will, had been another, smaller envelope, a personal one. My fingers, steady now, broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of his familiar stationery, covered in his strong, cursive hand. It began with 6 simple words. To Sarah, in case our daughter forgets who she is. 6 months later, as I was cutting the first new roses in the garden I had replanted myself, I realized that for the first time in years, the peace I felt didn't have to be bought with my silence. It was a genuine quiet, born not of loneliness, but of solitude. The house behind me felt lighter, brighter. I'd had the walls painted a warm cream color and replaced the heavy drapes with airy linen curtains that let the morning sun pour in. It was my home again, truly and completely. After reading Mark's final personal letter that night, the one that urged me to remember the strong woman I was, I finally understood his greatest gift. It wasn't the money, it was the freedom to choose my own path. In his old file cabinet, tucked behind the financial documents, I found another folder. It wasn't a secret will, but a dream. Detailed plans he had drafted for a charitable foundation, one dedicated to providing legal aid for those who couldn't afford it. He had never had the chance to bring it to life. I knew then what I had to do. The Mark Anderson Memorial Foundation was born from that dream. But I gave it a specific focus forged from my own pain, to protect the elderly from financial and emotional abuse by their own families. It became my life's work. My days were no longer spent waiting for a phone call that would bring only anxiety but were filled with purpose. I met with lawyers, set up a support hotline, and reviewed cases that were heartbreakingly similar to my own. The news of Dawn and Dave's downfall had traveled quickly. As Mr. Davies predicted, without my financial safety net, their world had imploded. Dave's business officially declared bankruptcy. They lost the luxury apartment and the new Lexus. I heard through Carol that the public humiliation was too much for them as a couple. The blame and resentment that had been directed at me now turned inward, poisoning what little was left of their relationship. Then, 2 months ago, a letter arrived. It was addressed in Dawn's familiar looping script, but the return address was a small apartment complex on the other side of town. My hands were steady as I opened it. It was not a plea for money. It was not a demand or a justification. It was just a letter. "Mom," it began, "I don't know if you'll even read this. I don't deserve for you to. I just wanted to tell you that Dave and I are divorced. I'm working part-time at a bookstore and living in a small place I can barely afford. For the first time in my life, I am truly on my own. And for the first time, I am beginning to understand what you tried to teach me. I am so, so sorry." Last week, I drove to that apartment complex. It was a modest building, clean but worlds away from the luxury she had once craved. She opened the door, and the woman standing there was not the one I remembered. She was thinner, her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was immaculate. On her small bookshelf were not fashion magazines, but well-worn classic novels. We sat in her tiny kitchen, and she poured me a cup of tea. "Thank you for coming, Mom," she said, her voice quiet and stripped of all its former artifice. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything." She looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time I saw genuine remorse. I am sorry for everything. It wasn't a perfect, magical absolution. The scars were too deep for that, but it was a beginning. I'm starting a new program at the foundation, I told her, the idea forming even as I spoke. A support group for the adult children to help them understand the line between accepting help and exploiting it. I paused, taking a sip of my tea. I need volunteers, people who can speak from experience. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were different. They were not tears of selfish desperation, but of a fragile, dawning hope. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. Now, as I stand in my garden, the scent of roses filling the air, I sometimes see her at the foundation office, quietly sorting through files, speaking with a gentle empathy to families in crisis. Our relationship will never be what it once was. The innocent trust of the past is gone forever, but perhaps in its place we can build something new, something truer, forged not in obligation or expectation, but in the harsh, clarifying fire of truth. For the first time in a very long time, as I look toward the future, I feel hope. As I watch the sunrise from my porch these days, my mind no longer dwells on what was lost, but on what I reclaimed. My freedom. Justice didn't just give me back my life, it gave me a new purpose. I learned that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and that true family must be built on a foundation of respect, not entitlement. Have you ever turned a painful experience into a source of strength? Let's connect in the comments below.